What's up guys, Dr. Alex here, and by the end of today's video, you are going to have a much deeper understanding of some of the most popular and controversial peptides on the market. We're going to cover a ton of compounds today. We're going to talk about what is their benefits, at least supposedly. We're going to cover the science behind each peptide. We're also going to talk about what data supports that science. We're going to go through some anecdotal reports, and then finally, we're going to roll all of that together and we're going to assign each one a tier. Check out the bookmarks in the description down below if you're looking for a specific compound, and comment us this. What are you guys interested in learning about? We want to hear from you. We've got some plans for some really awesome deep dives, but again, we want to hear from you guys. What do you want to learn about? And while you're at it, go ahead, hit the like button and blast the subscribe button harder than the rock blast trend. For those of you that are new here, and I hope at least some of you are, my name is Dr. Alex Tatem, and I'm a board-certified, fellowship-trained urologist specializing in men's health. That means that my practice is totally dedicated to helping men get the most out of life when it comes to performance enhancement, sexual health, and fertility. And our channel here serves as an extension of that commitment, but it does not count as personal medical advice. Ronick, roll the disclaimer. Also, I don't know how you guys are feeling, but I am post-call right now, which means I haven't slept in about 24 hours. I'm probably about 800 milligrams over the 400 milligrams daily limit of caffeine recommended by the FDA. I'm about 1 zenny deep and about 3 Gorilla Mind energy shots. So time to talk about some pharmacology. All right, guys, so here's the format for today. We've got all of our peptides here in our handy dandy Gorilla Mind birthday cake bar box that I am still working through weeks later. And Ronick's gonna throw one after another at me, and we're gonna start going through them. Shout out to Gorilla Mind, sponsored, not sponsored. All right, starting off with a banger, BPC 157. BPC 157 is also known as Body Protection Compound 157. And what's interesting is that this is a peptide that is derived from a naturally occurring peptide that's found in gastric juice. I believe it was originally found in dogs, and it was isolated, I believe, by this Greek researcher who's made this compound pretty much his life's work. And the whole point of BPC is that it's supposed to facilitate and aid healing. It's supposed to speed along the body's natural healing processes. And, you know, this is a pretty bold claim. I mean, this is the holy grail, something that we've all been looking for years and years. And whenever we look at in vitro models, so if we're administering BPC to a cluster of cells, what we see is we see fibroblasts, which are the cells that are responsible for repairing wounds, start to organize in a more efficient fashion. And so things start to move in the direction of healing. Now, unfortunately, most of that evidence is limited to either the benchtop or in animals. We don't really have any good clinical trials in humans for BPC 157. Not like a lack of human data has ever stopped any of you maniacs. Now, when you look at anecdotal reports regarding BPC 157, they range wildly. They go all the way from this cured my spinal stenosis and I avoided back surgery to this is just sugar water and it didn't do anything for me. And it's a little murky because BPC is commonly either administered on its own with something like TB500, or as we'll learn later on in the video, stacked with something like GHK-Cu, which is yet another peptide. So as many positive reports as you'll hear about BPC, you'll also hear negative or ones where it just didn't work. But the one thing that we haven't heard is serious negative side effects. And that actually matters. If we're talking in the world of performance enhancement, we know that the majority of the compounds that are used, whether it's anabolic steroids or high doses of human growth hormone, there are real side effects that can actually harm your health. And so far, at least in my experience, we haven't seen that with BPC. Now, that excludes any potential contamination issues or heavy metals that you might find in some gray market sources. But BPC itself seems pretty darn safe. So if we add it all together with the good reports, the not so good reports, and the general overall safety, BPC gets a solid C ranking as our first compound. Nailed it. All right, our next compound, the companion to BPC 157, or at least it's often described that way, TB500. So TB500 is actually a derivative of a different peptide called thymosin beta 4. And thymosin beta 4 reportedly works in a slightly different way than BPC. This is why the two of them are often combined together in what people have been calling the Wolverine stack. Like we discussed previously, BPC has been shown to affect fibroblasts, which is one way that our bodies can help repair themselves. TB500, or thymosin beta 4, if we're talking about its precursor protein, has been shown to work primarily through actin and cytoskeleton mechanisms. This is important for cell movement during wound repair. You have to actually move cells where they need to go to bridge gaps where there's been tear or injury to tissues. Now, there isn't any human data for TB500 itself. However, the precursor protein, thymosin beta 4, does show some benefit in helping people recover from corneal abrasions or scarring. But this is, again, in a very, very different application. These are actually topical eye drops that were used to help with corneal lacerations, scrapes, or dry eye. But that hasn't stopped the hype, and TB500 has become one of the hottest compounds to be used for recovery, particularly when paired with BPC 157. And much like BPC, reports have been half one way, half the other, with half of people claiming it's the best thing since sliced bread, other half of people saying this did nothing for me and I wasted however much money I just sent to China. And again, the challenge with this is that most of these products are sourced from gray market vendors, so you really don't know about the purity or the quality of the compound you're getting. But still, at least when it comes to thymosin beta 4, we haven't seen any adverse signaling when it comes to risks or side effects. That doesn't mean they aren't there, that just means we haven't seen them yet. But when it comes to sketchy things you can inject in yourself coming straight from some factory in China, it's actually not that bad. And so for that reason, we're putting TB500 right next to its brother BPC in C tier. All right, next on the hit list, IGF-1 LR3. So IGF-1 LR3, also known as IGF-LR3, is a long-release form of IGF-1. And for those of you that weren't sleeping through biochemistry in school, IGF-1 is how human growth hormone actually works. So when we're talking about growth hormone administration or any of the growth hormone secretagogues that will pop up later in this video, ultimately what those are trying to do is they're trying to secrete IGF-1. Secrete, stimulate, pick whatever word you want. We're talking off the cuff here today. And so the logic is, well, instead of taking all of these precursors, what if we just straight up administered IGF-1? The challenge with IGF-1 is it has an incredibly short half-life. And so if you're going to use it with any sort of practicality, you need something that's going to last a little bit longer in your system, which is what brings us to IGF-1 LR3, long release 3. And what's interesting is that although you will see a lot of peptides advertised on social media as helping build muscle, if you're looking at true peptides, at least in this new wave, IGF-1 LR3 is the only one out of these new generation of peptides that will actually stimulate hypertrophy. We have a lot of really cool new options when it comes to cutting weight or when it comes to healing potentially, but again, none of those contribute directly to hypertrophy the way that IGF-1 LR3 does. And what's nice is that IGF-1 has an incredible amount of literature backing it up. And so although IGF-1 LR3 may not, the actual compound in question, IGF-1, has more than almost any other compound that we're going to talk about today. It is incredibly potent, which also means it can have incredibly potent side effects. And what's interesting about IGF-1 administration, which includes IGF-1 LR3, is that unlike growth hormone, which when that's administered primarily causes an increase in blood glucose, the acute administration of IGF-1 LR3 can actually cause drops in blood sugar. This will actually act in some ways a little bit like insulin. So that means that some athletes will actually deal with sweats or feeling like they are low in blood sugar with administration of IGF-1 LR3. But as I often say, if it doesn't have side effects, it probably doesn't work at all. Maybe that's a bad sign for BPC and TB500. Jury's still out. But when it comes to rating IGF-1 LR3, we have to think about what options are also on the market. The truth is that growth hormone is a lot more available and a lot cheaper than it used to be, and that still remains the gold standard if we're going to be working through this somatotropic pathway. So IGF-1 LR3 has good data backing up the compound that it is supporting, but if you're going to be working on this pathway, you just got better options. So for that reason, we're going to give IGF-1 LR3 a solid B tier rating. All right, so next on the docket, we've got GHK-Cu.
Isn't that the stuff that looks like Compound V from The Boys?
I think that's methylene blue, but same vibes. So GHK-Cu gets its name from its ingredients. You've got 4 key ones. You've got glycine, histidine, lysine, and copper, which helps it actually be delivered. And there's actually a ton of data supporting GHK-Cu when in its topical form. Anyone with a background in dermatology or beauty is not going to be surprised by this. GHK-Cu has been around for years as a topical formulation, and it actually shows really, really good effects when it comes to clearing up skin. When that comes to skin tone, what people will call a glow or a radiance, generally speaking, it helps hydrate and repair collagen within the skin. What puts it on our radar, though, is the use of GHK-Cu as a subcutaneous injection. Now, the idea is pretty simple. You can only slather so much topical GHK-Cu on yourself. And so if you're looking for a more systemic, robust response, I don't know, maybe you're rapidly approaching 40 and your hair looks thinner every single day you look in the mirror. What if we could just inject this subcutaneously and try and go for that full systemic response? It makes sense scientifically, but unfortunately, drugs don't always translate that way. There are plenty of drugs that are totally safe to take topically, like, for example, ketoconazole, right? This is something that you can put on as a shampoo 2 to 3 times a week as a guide to help reduce male pattern baldness. But unfortunately, if you decide to swallow it, it'll cause liver failure. Now, we haven't seen any of those sorts of adverse signals in GHK-Q, but it's just a word of caution that just because a drug works in one form doesn't mean it's going to work in another form. And when it comes to GHK-Q, the literature is extremely sparse here. So most of its support comes from biohackers or freaking looks maxers like Clavicular, who I think has been blasting 300 milligrams of testosterone since age 14. Fun fact, kids, take testosterone too soon and it makes you shorter. Keep those growth plates open as long as possible, kids. But support for GHK-Q seems to be solid, and all the anecdotes seem to be universally positive. This puts it solidly above options like BPC or TB500 because we don't get the same sort of, didn't do anything for me that we've seen with those compounds. And just personally speaking, I have a lot of friends who run this year round, and they have pictures to back up their results. So for that reason, we're going to give GHK-Q a solid A rating. It seems to be a solid peptide, seems to be safe, seems to work, but we just don't have high quality clinical evidence. All right, we're starting off the GLP-1 train with an absolute banger. Next is Retatrutide. So we're gonna take a moment to go on a quick side quest here. If we go back through the history of medicine, peptides have been around for a really, really long time. One of the first medications ever commercialized was insulin, which is in fact a peptide. But when we talk about peptides, we're talking about these newer modern day compounds that have really kind of transformed how we approach medicine, especially performance enhancement and longevity. And the first drug to do that was actually Ozempic or semaglutide. This is the first GLP-1 drug that really took off. There were drugs before that. You had things like liraglutide, but semaglutide was the one to first knock it out of the park and bring about this revolution in medicine that we see today. And since semaglutide has been such an incredible success, also known as Ozempic or Wegovy, drug makers have been seeking to try and catch lightning in a bottle again and again. Right now, we're coming to you from Indianapolis, where Eli Lilly came out with tirzepatide a few years ago, also known as Mounjaro. Unlike semaglutide, which is just a GLP-1 agonist, tirzepatide actually works at the GIP receptor. This makes it an exponentially more powerful drug than just semaglutide on its own. But the race continues, and the next candidate that should be coming to the market within the next year is this drug, Retatrutide. And what separates Retatrutide from all the other compounds we're going to talk about today is that not only is it extremely, extremely effective, not only does it have really, really robust data, but we're actually getting access to what will probably be the biggest GLP-1 drug to ever be, at least when it comes out, before it even hits the market. This is pretty much unprecedented. We haven't had anything like this in medicine before, where we know a drug is going to be a blockbuster as it's still going through clinical trials, and yet somehow we can get access to it through drug manufacturers in the gray market. So it's crazy. If you want the most powerful, most effective GLP-1 drug, you can get it from a peptide website in China, but you can't get it from your doctor yet. So let's talk about what makes Retatrutide so special. And that comes down to its special trick, which is activity at the glucagon receptor. Much like tirzepatide, Retatrutide has activity at GLP-1 and the GIP receptor, but by adding in glucagon activity, Retatrutide has been shown to be exponentially more effective than just caloric restriction alone. So for all those people that might poo-poo GLP-1 drugs because they say, well, they just, limit your caloric intake and it's the fact that you can't eat as much, that's why you lose weight. They're right, when it comes to semaglutide. But when it comes to tirzepatide, the line gets pretty fuzzy, and whenever you start talking about retatrutide, you will burn more fat with retatrutide on a certain caloric intake than you would on just that caloric restriction alone. This is probably the first fat burner that won't land you in the ICU. If you haven't seen it yet, check out our shorts on DNP. That's a doozy. But retatrutide is wild. It's wildly effective. It seems to be as safe as any of the other GLP-1 drugs. And honestly, I think it is going to dominate the GLP-1 market whenever it finally finishes its clinical trials. So this drug is truly a one of one, both in how potent it is, how much data it has backing it, and whenever you talk about the situation of us being able to get the best possible drug before it even comes to market, at least the best possible drug for its particular application. So for those reasons, retatrutide gets our first S tier ranking. This is truly the GOAT of cutting agents, and don't let anybody tell you anything else. You know what's better than injecting just one sketchy peptide, Ronick?
What?
Injecting 3 of them at the same time. And that brings us to the glow stack. So what is the glow stack? It's become popular to try and mix compounds to get a better effect than just one on their own. This is not new to anybody in the longevity or the performance enhancement space. We stack drugs all the time. Much like me stacking both caffeine and nicotine to stay awake for today's shoot. And the goal is to try and get multiple compounds that are synergistic, that can work together, and that synergy actually produces an effect that is greater than either one of those in isolation or either one of those combined independently. So with the glow stack, we're talking about BPC 157, TB 500, and GHK-Cu. So we've got all of our healing, pro-collagen, and anti-inflammatory compounds all rolled in together for a single injection. And there are people that absolutely swear by this stack. But the problem is that this is just made up of a bunch of other drugs that only have so-so data backing them up. And so-so's being generous here. So as much as I love the idea of an all-in-one injection to take care of all of your healing and skincare needs, Glow Stack only gets a C rating for us. And the reason is that a compound or a stack is only as strong as its weakest link. And for that reason, we're staying at C tier. All the beauty influencers are going to absolutely flame me after this.
Holy upper eyelid exposure, Alex.
Oh my God, that comment. Gotcha. Oh my gosh, Ronick, this one's bringing back some memories for me.
What kind?
Mostly good ones, mostly from fellowship. Guys, right now we're talking about Ipamorelin. All right, so what is this compound and why do I have nostalgia about it? Spoiler alert, my nostalgia is not related to me taking Ipamorelin personally, but when I was in fellowship, this was one of the most popular compounds requested by patients at the time because it was brand new, which I hate to say means that it's officially old because I've been out of training for some time now. But what is Ipamorelin? Ipamorelin sits in a class of compounds called GH-secretagogues. The demand for this drug and those other GH-secretagogues is actually the interesting result of science colliding with legislation. Essentially, there used to be an absolute plethora of growth hormone clinics focused on longevity throughout the United States. And I believe that went away with the 1993 amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. This was a super controversial time where people were, all up in arms about steroids and growth hormone use. And during an amendment to this actual law on the books that helps dictate how we manage drugs in the United States, growth hormone was specifically banned for use in any context that wasn't a specific disease state or growth hormone deficiency. And for those of you that have any sort of background in medicine, you'll know that that is wild. As doctors, we use medications off-label or for other reasons their original intended use all the time. And if you read that law carefully, at least the language of it, it is often interpreted as stating that doctors could be liable of violating the law for prescribing growth hormone off-label. You combine that with the closure of all these growth hormone clinics, and all of a sudden there is a huge demand in the market for medications that could stimulate growth hormone release without actually being growth hormone. Enter Ipamorelin, among many other compounds. Ipamorelin actually stimulates growth hormone release by targeting the ghrelin receptor. The ghrelin receptor is a common target for a lot of growth hormone secretagogues. Another one that does this is MK677, but Ipamorelin, unlike MK, is actually injectable. And this one does have some clinical data behind it. It was used in, I believe it was a study looking at gut healing following abdominal surgery. I'm pulling this one from the back of my memory banks, so I can't remember if it was exactly gut surgery or if it was used in an inflammatory gut syndrome trial, like for something like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. I believe it was surgery. But essentially, the results were pretty equivocal, and Ipamorelin was quickly abandoned as a potential drug to come to market shortly thereafter. And so it does increase IGF-1 levels. We've seen that anecdotally with people who have been taking Ipamorelin for years. The question is it raising them enough to do something, and is it worth injecting yourself at least once a day? Again, we have to remember that growth hormone is pretty easily accessible if you want to get it now, but I understand not everybody wants to buy their growth hormone out of a gym bag out behind their local gym. So yes, Ipamorelin does have some clinical data backing it. And when I say clinical, I mean, essentially trial data. It seems to be safe. I've seen this drug prescribed for many years with no real adverse reactions beyond maybe some injection site reactions. But is it really a great option? Again, why are you trying to boost growth hormone? If you really want to cut weight and lose fat, we have so much better options now. And if you really want to boost your IGF-1 as much as possible, well, we have actual growth hormone for that. So for that reason, Ipamorelin, like a lot of the growth hormone secretagogues, gets a D tier rating for us. It's just really hard to find a situation in which you would recommend Ipamorelin to somebody. I can't wait for all my compounding pharmacy buddies to like rage text me after this. I love you guys. Please don't hate me. Another one. Ooh, we've got an interesting one. We are talking right now about Epithalon. Why does Epithalon sound like an alien race from the Warhammer 40K universe? One of my biggest revelations of getting older is realizing that all the super jack dudes in the gym are just freaking nerds that decided to be autistic about one specific thing. Yeah, I know. Like all the jocks ended up like fat alcoholics, but all the dudes that are actually jacked for the rest of their life are 100% on the spectrum. Autism is a superpower, kids. Don't let anybody tell you any different. All right, so what makes Epithalon interesting is that it's the first compound that we're looking at today that is specifically engineered towards longevity. Now, you could argue that maybe the growth hormone secretagogues boost IGF-1 and that contributes to longevity, but Epithalon is pretty interesting. It's the only peptide that is specifically trying to lengthen your telomeres. Now, there isn't a whole lot of benchtop evidence supporting this, but think of it along these lines. Whenever a cell is trying to divide, it essentially has to copy all of its genetic information over here into the same cell over here, or its daughter cell. And in order to do that, you actually have proteins that read along the DNA, almost like a typewriter of sorts, and copy it line for line for line. But what's interesting is that in order to do that, it actually sits on top of the DNA strand and rides across it almost like a gear on top of a line of track. But the gear itself takes up space. So when it gets to the very, very end, it can't copy what it's immediately on top of. And so as a result, if let's say it's copying something that's 100 characters long, it actually only copies about 98 characters. Now, your body tries to compensate for this, and at the very end of this DNA, at the very end of the chromosome, is a series of repeating DNA strands and some proteins that are designed to be there just so they could be trimmed off safely to allow for hopefully as many replications as that cell is going to need in its lifetime. But as you age, this section of DNA and proteins, your telomeres, become shorter and shorter. But there are some enzymes that can help preserve these telomeres, and that is called telomerase. We're not very creative in biochemistry, so we just add the ending A's onto anything just to describe some sort of enzyme that's acting on it, which is super unhelpful because sometimes an A's is something that breaks down a certain protein, but in other ways, it's also something that could build back up something. We're highly inconsistent people. This is why I gave up benchtop research in favor of just slinging testosterone and doing penis surgery. But the idea of Epithalon is that it stimulates telomerase, which will lengthen your telomeres and hopefully give you more years on this earth. This has been demonstrated on the benchtop, but trying to extrapolate the results from a couple cell lines in primary scientific literature into a sub-Q administration that goes throughout the entire human body is a monumental leap. So Epithalon is intriguing, but it has almost no data to back it up, and there's no way to actually measure its effects in a whole human. Plus, nobody's lived long enough to ever see if it provides any benefit, and as a result, this is the first compound that you're going to see faked or counterfeited or just being salt water whenever you get it in the mail. So Epithalon has an intriguing mechanism, but almost nothing to back it up. And as a result, this gets our first F tier of the day. Save your money and, I don't know, buy more creatine.
Walter White special.
Walter White special. Oh, dear God. Oh, I love it. Breaking Bad reference. All right, guys. So we've got one here that is not technically a peptide, but it has gotten so popular online, we just had to include it in this one. And that is Methylene Blue. So a fun fact, this is a drug that we actually used whenever I was in training, but not for any sort of real medical purpose. Methylene Blue, when injected into somebody's vein, actually gets processed through the kidneys incredibly quickly. So if you happen to be a urologist or you're doing surgery in somebody's belly and you're trying to find urine or you're trying to find the ureters, so the tubes that carry urine, one of the fastest ways to do that is to give somebody a shot of methylene blue in the arm, and believe it or not, within a matter of seconds, they will start making dark blue urine, which is pretty freaking wild. Now, it does have some other applications. Methylene blue is used for something called methemoglobinemia. And methemoglobinemia is a condition where essentially your red blood cells can't carry oxygen anymore. It's usually caused by nitrate poisoning, which is insanely rare, but administration of methylene blue can actually reverse that. So unlike a lot of compounds on this, methylene blue is something that has real medical applications. The question is, does it actually work for longevity? A lot of people have proposed mechanisms for how it might help. They say that, oh, it could rejuvenate mitochondria, it reduces oxidative stress, etc., etc. But unfortunately, there is absolutely zero evidence to support any of this in a longevity context. And unlike many of the other compounds we've talked today, this can actually be extremely toxic if you overdose on it, and it will permanently stain your skin and your fingernails blue if you're not careful. So if you're trying to find a ureter or, make somebody pee blue, this gets an S tier rating, but for our purposes today, methylene blue gets a solid F tier. There is simply no reason anyone should take this for performance enhancement or longevity. At least no data to support that yet. All right, next one. We keep the secretagogue train rolling with Tesamorelin. Tesamorelin is really interesting because unlike a lot of other secretagogues, this is a direct GHRH analog, which means that it simulates growth hormone releasing hormone, which is the precursor to growth hormone release, as you probably guessed from the title. A similar, milder compound would be something like Sermorelin. But unlike Sermorelin, Tesamorelin is actually a commercially available product that you could probably get prescribed to you tomorrow, provided you're someone taking HIV medication from the 90s/2000s and you've got lipodystrophy. An unfortunate reality for a lot of patients taking HIV medications, especially older ones, is that they would end up getting these fat deposits that were really unsightly and just not super cosmetic. And, they wanted something to combat that. So researchers were motivated to try and find an option that boosted growth hormone profoundly. And they came up with this, which is Tesamorelin. And Tesamorelin actually really does work. It boosts growth hormone so much that you get the benefit of losing fat around the midsection, which is something that is classically associated with growth hormone administration. And it was effective in treating these patients with this abnormal fat deposition due to their HIV medications. So yes, it absolutely does its job, and it does it very, very effectively. There have never been any clinical trials looking at its use in totally healthy people that don't have lipodystrophy and are taking it for the purposes of cosmesis and loss of central adiposity, but there are tons of anecdotal reports supporting its use for that effect. The biggest drawback is just if you want pharma-grade Tesamorelin, it is really, really freaking expensive, which is what makes it a challenge when we have to grade it, because it is so much more expensive to get pharma-grade Tesamorelin than it is to actually get gray market growth hormone. But because it's so potent, because it's commercially available, it has a lot more going for it than almost any other secretagogue out there. So for that reason alone, we're going to break from the mold and we're going to give Tesamorelin a solid B tier rating. It's good at what it does. We have better options, but it is much better than most of its peers. And that's Tesamorelin. Got it. Our last compound of the day, mostly because we're running out of bottles. Subscribe if you want to see part 2 where we cover the rest of these. But we're going out with a bang with growth hormone, the OG somatotropin. So growth hormone is a really interesting compound, both when you look at its history and how goated it is when it comes to performance enhancement. This is one of the OG peptides. Growth hormone was actually first isolated from cadavers, where they would actually take cadavers' brain tissue, they would mince it up, and they would purify it down to get the growth hormone that you need from the pituitary gland. The pituitary makes a bunch of important stuff. Growth hormone was just one of it, but it was interesting in that it was one of the first medications to be isolated in this way. And this was totally revolutionary because it allowed growth hormone deficient children to be treated in a way that wasn't possible before. When it comes to medicine, despite most marketing claims from pharmaceutical companies, there are only a handful of moments in history where something is truly revolutionary and truly changes the way that we approach how we treat patients. And growth hormone was exactly that. Now, the plot unfortunately thickens from there. There is this condition that's commonly known as mad cow disease, also known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, where a rogue protein, not a virus, not a bacteria, but a rogue misshapen protein can actually touch another protein, cause that to also become misshapen, which then touches more proteins, etc., etc. You get the idea. And you can actually build up plaques in the brain that can cause, I don't know, psychosis and death. And this is transmitted primarily by eating an infected animal or other human in the case of something called Kuru, which I recommend that you Google on one of those hidden incognito browser tabs. But this unfortunately reared its head when it came to trying to process out cadaveric growth hormone. And as a result, the cadaveric production of growth hormone was totally shut down due to the risk of potentially passing on this incredibly strange disease that at the time was absolutely terrifying. And so it actually pushed scientists to develop something called recombinant growth hormone. Recombinant in this case just means lab grown, but this was still really novel. I could be wrong, Ronick, but I believe growth hormone was the first recombinant peptide to hit the market. If we're looking at older history, things like insulin, those were still derived from living counterparts through like cadaveric harvesting or from animals. But the contamination from Creutzfeldt-Jakob, mad cow disease, Kuru, whatever you want to call it, is what pushed science forward to create recombinant or lab-grown growth hormone. And then Dave Palumbo started shooting it up in absolute gobs and gobs, and now we have modern bodybuilding. Comment down below if you actually remember who Dave Palumbo was. Is Dave Palumbo still alive, Ronick?
Yeah, he has a podcast, RX Muscle.
All right. Well, shout out to Dave Palumbo repping it. I wonder what his abdomen looks like now. Has he fixed his six pack?
He has his shirt on all the time.
I don't know. Let us know down in the comments now. What is Dave Palumbo's six pack looking like these days? So anyway, back to the compound at hand. Growth hormone is simply the best in class at what it does. It totally beats out all of the imitators. It's better than Tesamorelin. It's better than all the secretagogues. It's better than actual IGF-1 or IGF-1 LR3. This is simply the gold standard when it comes to trying to boost the somatotropic pathway. And it used to be incredibly hard to get and incredibly hard to produce. And yes, although we will always have issues with gray market sourcing when it comes to contamination, but quality growth hormone has actually never been easier to get than it is nowadays, and it's never been more cost effective. Now, quick disclaimer, I don't recommend that anybody inject themselves with anything they haven't been prescribed by a doctor, but we're trying to be honest here. So for that reason, due to its extreme efficacy, due to the fact that it's backed by tons and tons of scientific literature when it comes to cutting fat, when it comes to building muscle, when it comes to recovery, collagen, tissue, joint repair, growth hormone gets an absolutely unopposed S tier ranking for us. All of the benefits that you see advertised for all of the secretagogues, whether it's Tesamorelin, Ipamorelin, all these things that are supposed to improve your skin, nails, hair, it all comes down to this. It comes down to growth hormone stimulating IGF-1 release, and nothing does that better than the real stuff. And with that, we have officially run out of bottles. So I think that is going to conclude part 1 of our ultimate peptide tier list. So for you guys who have watched this entire video, thank you for sticking with us. Go ahead and comment down below. We've got about 20 more compounds that we're going to cover, everything from AOD 9604, which is a growth hormone derivative. We're including some of the original GHRP2 and GHRP6s, which are again more growth hormone derivatives. And we're going to get a little wild and crazy with some of the more esoteric peptides that many of you may not have heard of yet. But we want to hear from you. So leave your comments down below. Let us know what you want to hear about next. And we're going to keep this whole peptide list going. We're going to carry over this list into our next video. So ultimately, at the end of this series, we're going to have the massive master peptide tier list, which we can then all argue about over in the comments. So until next time, this is Dr. Alex signing off.